This episode of Mossback is presented by the Crosscut Festival.
You know, if you drive around Oregon and Washington today, you'll go into small towns where they have Babe the Blue Ox carvings and chainsaw artworks of Paul Bunyan, giant statues. Portland has a giant Paul Bunyan statue. You know, he became very much a Northwest icon, and we didn't really think about Maine or Michigan or any of those places. But the stories that seem to have come from there, we absorbed and kind of made our own.
Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from KCTS9 and Crosscut. I'm Sarah Bernard.
I'm Knute Berger.
And today we are here to talk about a piece of American lore that is really spread across the continent, but it does have a pretty strong foothold in the Pacific Northwest too, and that is the tall tales of lumberjack Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan. Few figures loom as large in Northwest lore as Paul Bunyan and his big blue ox named Babe.
Even though I live under a rock, I too know who Paul Bunyan is, sort of, because I feel like he was everywhere. I just have these vague memories of, kids' books and cartoons.
Paul Bunyan could clear large wooded areas with a single stroke of his large, sharp axe.
And little scraps. I have little scraps of like Disney type songs in my head, and I don't really know. Probably, as a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, I must have sort of absorbed Paul Bunyan material through osmosis because it's absolutely everywhere. And it's really only after watching the Mossback's Northwest video that I had any real inkling of how incredibly popular he really was and is.
There are children's books, campfire stories, cartoons, murals, giant Paul Bunyan statues, festivals, poems. There is even a Paul Bunyan opera.
Which, by the way, you really should watch. If you haven't already seen it, we suggest you stop right now, go to the show notes or the show page at crosscut.com and check it out.
Folklore or fake lore? It turns out to be a really interesting story, and the story begins with stories. I mean, Paul Bunyan is this legendary logger. He and his blue ox Babe, would stride through America, and they could, chop down forests. They could solve any problem. They could reshape the landscape. And I grew up with Paul Bunyan stories. I probably watched the same Disney cartoons, and there were school books and story time, tales of Paul Bunyan. And when I was at summer camp, I went to summer camp up in near Granite Falls, Washington, and it was in a former logging area, been logged in the 19th century. And there were all kinds of, like in the woods, there were all kinds of old logging equipment and that kind of thing. And we learned forest skills. I mean, we went camping, but we also learned like how to use a double person saw, and you learned how to chop wood, and we had competitions like little lumberjack festivals. The guy who ran the camp, had giant flannel shirt, kind of like Paul, and he was a really tall guy, kind of Paul Bunyan-esque. And every summer, we would have a Paul Bunyan campfire. And we'd go out into the woods in this big campfire circle and light the fire. And then a kid from each of the tents or groups was chosen to stand up in front of the whole camp and tell a Paul Bunyan story.
Wow.
And so this would have been like 1963, I think, or way back then, I was picked by my tent to tell a Paul Bunyan story. And this camp, Hidden Valley Camp, for those people who want to know, had a this kind of dank brown pond, and it was called Purdy Creek. And so the story that I told was that Paul Bunyan had come through this area during the logging days and was chewing tobacco. Oh. And Babe the Blue Ox was with him, and he spit the tobacco juice into one of Babe's footprints and looked at it and said, "Ain't that purty?" And that's how our creek got its name. So I became a relator of local Paul Bunyan lore. So, I haven't thought about much Paul Bunyan in, recent years. And maybe one reason is that loggers aren't quite what they used to be and, as symbols. But I got a letter from a part-time teacher who does story times and writing workshops with little kids, grade schoolers. And she wanted to know if she wanted to teach them to write a story about a legend. Mm-hmm. And she said, are there any Paul Bunyan stories about Seattle? Oh. And I thought, I don't remember actually ever hearing any stories about Seattle. And man, I started looking into it. I contacted the Seattle Public Library. I said, do you guys, they have a Paul Bunyan Day, or used to, at the Seattle Public Library. And they have their children's library has a bunch of Paul Bunyan stuff. And I said, do you have any stories about Seattle? And they told me about a couple of books. And one was a book by a local woman named Esther Shepard. And her papers are at the University of Washington. She was a very successful writer. And in the 1920s, she wrote a book of Paul Bunyan tales. And in that book, it contains several chapters which are about, Paul Bunyan dragging his axe and digging Hood Canal, or digging Elliott Bay and using the dirt to make Mount Rainier. And there's even, a story of him up in Skagit Flats. There's a story in Eastern Washington. And these were stories that she said that she had accumulated from local loggers. These were things that local loggers told each other.
Mm. So it's not like they're presented as truth, but are they in fact presented as truly collected? Like it's not like she thought them up. She doesn't present them as fiction.
No, she wasn't necessarily making up stories, although she was shaping them. She actually talks in the introduction of the book about how when these stories were related from loggers to each other, they were always presented as being true. Mm. That was part of the affect of the story was everybody sitting around the bunkhouse, and somebody says, well, I used to work with this guy named Paul Bunyan, and he blah, blah, blah. And so every story had this kind of authenticity to it, even though everybody knew it was false.
Okay. Huh.
But the stories were, entertaining. They were often about, how the loggers and Paul, personification of a logger, was solving problems.
Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems.
Their job, the bosses weren't solving problems. We were solving problems. And we could get anything done that the bosses wanted, even if it was unreasonable.
Once, there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that.
So she frames it in that way. And this is an interesting part of the story is, what were the origins of Paul Bunyan and who told these stories, if anyone? And so it was presented as, these are the stories that, the guys in the woods are telling each other. So I found that really fascinating, and I began to kind of dig into that. And then the story got way more complicated than I was expecting.
Of course, always does.
So her book was published in the early 1920s. At the same time, another Seattle or Northwest author, James Stevens, wrote a book about Paul Bunyan. And this was much more of a kind of in the realm of mythological, deeper, bigger, Homeric kind of Paul Bunyan story. And this gets to sort of the time that these things were happening. So if you go back, Paul Bunyan's origins appear to be maybe as early as the mid-19th century. A minor character, possibly based on a French-Canadian figure, usually as a humorous kind of person, and not at all the sort of big, larger-than-life fellow that we all got to know.
Huh. Do we know
And
anything more about that?
There's a whole bunch of different theories about who it was based on, but what most people agree on is that the early stories entered into the sort of popular culture out of Quebec and Maine in the Northeast. And then they follow a path, which is interesting because Paul Bunyan is taking on the biggest task. Well, as you're denuding New England and whatnot, where do you move? You move to the upper Midwest. And this is where you have the sort of a lot of logger lore. You have the Scandinavian immigrants who were working in the logging camps. And this is where sort of the Paul Bunyan story really catches fire. He becomes, I think, a more important figure. People from Minnesota or Michigan will swear that they are the origin place of Paul Bunyan. Everybody along the road sort of claims him as originating there.
Right.
And eventually he works his way out to the Pacific coast where, of course, you've got the coast redwoods, you have the old growth forest of the Northwest. And so the stories follow him out to the West Coast. And so suddenly Paul is the ultimate lumbersexual Northwesterner. He's
Right.
got the plaid shirt. We have stories about what he did out here. Now, nobody really believes these stories.
Right.
Paul Bunyan did not create the Columbia River but it's becomes part of this sort of tall tales, which is part of what we might think of as Western folklore. Mm-hmm. The stories of the 19th century where the exaggerated frontiersman, the classic example is Davy Crockett, which kids in the 50s remember the Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier.
Yeah.
He killed a bar when he was only 3, that kind of thing. Well, this kind of tall tale telling has roots in other aspects of American culture. So it's interesting because he still wasn't famous until around World War I.
Huh.
It's not necessarily connected to the war, but there was a logging company in California that compiled some Paul Bunyan stories into basically a sales catalog, a promotional thing. And this became popular. And then people started talking about Paul Bunyan stories. And the newspapers in Seattle and other places, James Stevens wrote about Paul Bunyan and was asked to contribute articles to the American Mercury, edited by H.L. Mencken. And he kind of, Paul hit an area in that sort of, I would say, the 1920s and 30s in particular, where after World War I, America was seeking some sort of authentic identity of its own. We'd been victorious in World War I. We were kind of a world power. But you have a lot of cultural disruption. You have a resurgence of anti-immigration. And you have this term of Americanization. And I think Paul Bunyan is part of this political desire to create a unique, rooted national identity figure at that particular time. Paul's emergence seemed to feed a Euro-American appetite for epic history. An article in the Seattle PI called Bunyan, quote, America's only folklore character. And then he kind of goes hog wild in the popular culture. So my paternal grandfather, who was also named Knute Berger, was an inventor of logging equipment, among other things. And so he was an engineer, a mechanical engineer, and he created some very important hauling equipment and that kind of thing that was used in the lumber camps. And my father, through, I think, connections with his father, had summer jobs for a couple of years in Olympic Peninsula timber camps. And this was the 1930s. This is before helmets, before safety equipment. A lot of the logging is still by hand. It hasn't converted to, chainsaws and a lot of advanced mechanization. And he told stories at the dinner table about what life was like out in Nia Bay in the 1930s when he was working in the camps. Now, my father he was a college boy. He wasn't, particularly robust. He had, kind of a skinny guy with glasses, and he worked on a survey crew one summer, I think, and then another time he was assistant to the camp doctor. And so he saw a lot of stuff, and it was interesting because his stories of life in the logging camp there was no mythology. There was no Paul Bunyan. He experienced these camps as raw, crude, unkind. He said there would be these times during the months he was out there where suddenly everyone would disappear from the bunkhouse at night. And you would go to a field or a clear-cut area and would just have a mass brawl. They would just beat the holy you-know-what out of each other. Wow. And, and then the next day, they were back at breakfast and ready to go to work. There was a lot of, blowing off of steam. His logging stories were often about death and injury, guys blowing all their wages in a bordello outside of Port Angeles and that kind of thing. There was none of the romance. But we were fascinated by these stories because of the sort of danger involved and the things that he saw that you wouldn't see. So we grew up with a very non-romantic account of what working in a logging camp was like. Yet, on the other hand, in school, we were getting this other completely different message, but it was almost like they were just two different worlds.
We'll be right back.
Support for the Mossback podcast comes from the Crosscut Festival, happening online and in Seattle, May 4th through the 7th. Join us in celebrating bold ideas for a changing world at our biggest event of the year, featuring fireside conversations, panels, live podcast recordings, workshops, and special events that explore forward thinking in politics, social justice, the environment, history, innovation, and more. Spend your week with the community of the curious at the Crosscut Festival this spring. More information at crosscut.com/festival.
So, what kind of stories did loggers actually tell each other? And is Paul Bunyan a kind of natural folklore that emerged from these, these logging groups as a kind of oral history and then took on a larger life? Or is it something that has maybe a tiny root in that, but is mostly just by promoters, authors, people trying to sell something or use Paul and Babe as avatars of whatever they're pushing, whatever politics or commercial product they're pushing? And one of the reasons this debate came up was there was a guy who's one of the sort of fathers of American folklore studies academically, Richard Corson. And he said, look, I've talked to all these loggers. They never talk about Paul Bunyan. They're talking about sex and death and injury and stuff related to their work. They're not sitting around telling epic, Homeric, tales. Right. And so he wrote a book where he attacked James Stevens, the author, basically saying, you're just making all this stuff up and you're turning it into, it's literature. It's not folklore. It's not genuine. And he coined the term fake lore. Mm-hmm. And so this debate then raged as to what is folklore, what is fake lore, and is Paul Bunyan, which side of that debate is he on?
Mm-hmm. Right, which is, I can see how that's an enduring debate and a complex one, because folklore in itself, where do you draw the line exactly, I guess is the question. I mean, what is genuine? What counts as authentic? But it's like, how do we prove that anyway?
Right. Well, that was the interesting thing, because I talked to a number of scholars who teach folklore at the university level. One is a guy named Robert Walls, who's at Notre Dame and knows a lot about the Northwest, has connections here. But he wrote a vast thesis, 700-page thesis about Paul Bunyan. And he says, well, nowadays, this was a raging debate, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. But now people kind of question all the categories. It's sort of like, well, what is folk? What is lore? What is fake? What if you're talking about folklore, the idea is that there's a certain kind of authenticity and lack of outside influence that kind of creates an oral culture that then kind of turns into the subject of folkloric researchers who come and record. And if you think about it, in the time Paul Bunyan sort of burst on the scene, this was the period when people were discovering folk music, when they were recording the blues, they're recording country music. They're looking, I think, for this very thing, this thing that says, this is a true, only we've produced it culture. Mm-hmm. And so that, but it, like you say, it's where you draw the line. And Paul Bunyan complicated that further because he became such a vessel for popular culture. In the 30s, Paul Bunyan is used as both pro and anti-union kind of icon. The anti-union is sort of, Paul doesn't need a union. He can solve all these problems on his own. And the other side, people, socialists and whatnot, are using Paul Bunyan as, the absolute personification of the working man. Mm-hmm. During the New Deal, the WPA, Paul Bunyan murals were painted all over the place. There's some here in Washington, but they're all over the country. Of this, this massive figure and his ox, and they're, plowing the land or chopping trees, and so it was this symbol of progress, this symbol of problem solving, as only Americans can. Only Americans are up to the task of getting us out of the Depression. And so
using him for anything that he seemed to fit.
Yes, exactly. But there were people who were interested in him as for artistic purposes. And a lot of it to the same purpose of, I think, creating an American culture that felt like, for the whites, felt indigenous, And so you have Carl Sandburg, Robert Frost, and of all people, the British author W.H. Auden writing about Paul Bunyan. And in the case of Auden, he was the one that wrote the libretto for this Paul Bunyan operetta that was funded by the New Deal, by the WPA. And so you had W.H. Auden writing this Paul Bunyan opera. You had Benjamin Britten writing the music. Wow. And then you had like the Roosevelt administration funding it. And it absolutely bombed, by the way. Paul Bunyan actually doesn't appear in the opera, but he's this kind of, spiritual presence. But they're dancing loggers and all all kinds of things.
Oh, man. Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize it was even, got federal funding as well, which sort of, I don't know, feels like a little bit of a feather in the cap of the folklore argument that this is a lot of his, explosion of popularity in the early 20th century had a lot to do with propaganda. To me, I can't help but feel really conflicted about it, what Paul Bunyan kind of represents, not only just straight up cutting down the forests, taming the land, quote unquote, but also this westward movement of the early U.S. settlers and, manifest destiny and this idea, that white people had, that they were like, well, this is totally ours, definitely ours, and we're absolutely destined to take it, of course. Well, of course, Paul Bunyan was an attractive figure for that. It strikes me as problematic, I guess,
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no indigenous people, there are no immigrants, certainly immigrants of color in these stories. The assumption, as you say, is Paul Bunyan moves to an area that's a blank slate. Mm-hmm. There's nothing there. There's no the wildlife, the people, the native people, anybody else. He comes into these areas and can do whatever he wants and or whatever he's told to do. Mm-hmm. And he and Babe, go through just cutting vast swaths of forest down. And certainly there's no sense of what comes after, suburbs, urbanization, pollution. None of these stories deal with global warming.
Right.
There's some later stories or later sort of propaganda use, I guess, if you want to say, where Paul promotes the forest as a resource, therefore worth protecting. And this is the old sort of Smokey the Bear thing, which is, we're saving forest fires because, we're trying to eliminate forest fires because you know how much timber goes up in flames every year and what it's worth. That was sort of the original impetus for, having a forest service, having firefighting capabilities and that kind of thing. And Paul is seen then as sort of a representative of companies that are doing sensible forestry. They're replanting, or they're cutting sustainably and that kind of thing. Mm. The other interesting thing, I think, too, is when you think about, well, is he folklore? Is he propaganda? What is he? You can be all those things. To me, he's more comparable to, say, Superman or Wonder Woman or the Marvel universe, in the sense that, he's appealing to these sort of really basic archetypes in our culture. But people back in the day, people were saying, well, he's the new Hercules, or he's the new King Arthur, he's the new Thor. They were comparing him to Norse gods and things like that. But I think he's really much more in this category of a folkish figure that is really a literary creation and then a promotional creation, all kind of mushed together. And there's actually a Marvel comic book where Captain America comes into this space where there's this primitive old-growth forest, and who emerges from the forest to greet Captain America, is Paul Bunyan. So he does live on in our culture. He pops up in various places, and I think he'll continue to morph. But he's got a lot to answer for.
Right.
Don't you think?
That's the only thing. I do have a lot of questions for him, really. I mean, I can't really look away from all the things he was lauded for and the sort of origins of where he would come from and why white America in particular would be really interested in promoting him unquestioningly, like a lot of complications there for me. But then as a supersized, all-powerful fantasy, I can see how that's kind of fun and appealing.
The fantasy world in our culture is expanding at a rapid rate, right?
Yeah.
Fantasy games, fantasy TV shows. Mm-hmm. People are living in a fantasy world constantly, and both in the political realm and in the literary realm and in the interactive game realm. And I think, Paul will probably bounce around and people will try him out, like, well, does this work? But he's got a lot of competition now. Mm-hmm. And I think culturally we're just really experimenting in the same space that Paul emerged from, at least partly. Mm-hmm. We're experimenting in that space, and, we're also kind of pushing like, well, how far can you have a productive society or a constant society when half the people are living in a fantasy world?
Right.
I mean, that's sort of the deeper issue that we're faced with.
Yeah.
What actually is the metaverse?
Another topic for another podcast episode.
There you go.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. This episode was produced by me, Sarah Bernard, and the executive producer is Mark Baumgarten. Editorial assistance from Mason Bryan. Cover art by Greg Cohen. And many thanks to engineer Rusty Bacall for building out an amazing COVID-friendly audio studio. If you'd like to check out more videos from the 5 seasons of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them all at crosscut.com or kcts9.org. For more on all things Mossback, go to crosscut.com/Mossback. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen. And if you like the show, please review us. It really helps other people find us. And if you'd like to support the work we do at Crosscut, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to KCTS9's on-demand programming and a subscription to the Mossback Den newsletter, where Knute shares even more Pacific Northwest history. Mossback is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Sarah Bernard, and we'll be back soon with another episode.